So the next question is, we are lacking language and theory and practice to explain the concept of student learning and assessment. We pay attention to attendance, grades, course completion. What does it mean to ensure student learning?
I'll take this one for Cheryl. So I am going to throw into the chat a link to an activity. So not surprising, as a person that runs a National Institute with my background in philosophy, I have a philosophy activity that I'm going to share with you. There's one that's designed for faculty and one for student affairs. I'll put both in the chat in just a minute. But the point is to say, before we even engage in the process of assessing student learning, we have philosophical lenses is the way that we present it. There's 4 that are the most prevalent that guide our approach to this. And a lot of times we have multiple ones within a department. We have multiple ones across our institution. At different times, one is more prevalent than another. And knowing which one we're dealing with in our conversation can really help us not crosstalk each other. So I'll just give you a brief high-level overview. One, the one we hear most often is measurement. That assessment is about picking the right measure. So when you have a conversation with someone that's like, I have this outcome, how do I measure it? And it's like, no, we got to back up. We've been having this whole design conversation and intentionality and values and all of this sort of piece. We did not yet in any of our chat this afternoon get to measure. That comes later. And so, but there's a whole swath, and that's not to say you're wrong, that immediately starts with measure. I need a pre-post. It's got to be standardized. I got to make sure everybody got it. I need to have comparison. If my N size is too small, forget about it. I don't want to look at it. That's measurement. Another one is that compliance, which is, this is an add-on, it's bureaucratic. This is not about teaching and learning. I don't know why I have to do this. What do you want me to put on a report? Let me go back about my job. And that's really based from that experience that we've had about where assessment fits in that space. The third one is that student-centered, which is, how are students experiencing our learning? How are they knowing where they are in that learning trajectory so that they're like actively participating in their own learning and advancing to those learning outcomes? Most of our learning outcomes were written for us, not for our students. We don't tell our students about them. And then they leave going, what did I get from this? And we're like, critical thinking, problem solving skills. And they're like, what? No, I didn't. And you're like, oh, that was a class. And also it's in the title of the class. I didn't get it. So really thinking about how are we actively engaging our students in knowing where they are in their own learning journey is another. And that looks very different. It has different measures. It has where you do it is very different. And the last is that teaching and learning that's about the questions of praxis that we have. And is this working for my students, and in what ways, and all of that. So I think first and foremost, I would say, figure out what's your sort of combination of those. Do the activity, do it with a friend, do it alone, whatever. And then engage in conversations on, are we too heavy on this one? Is this where we want to be about my beliefs? And get to that consensus on, where do we need to be and what does assessment mean for us? And what does good assessment practice look like for us? Because good practice will look very different, and it depends on which one of those ones you want to do. But because of how assessment has been implemented, we get to, what's the measure, and tell me how to do it. And so anytime you see a 5-step process that's going to change your life, red flag, pause, and go back to Cheryl's, find a safe place and talk to someone about it. Get into a conversation and engage. So there's not one way to do it, there's many, but being mindful of the decisions you make and what that means will help you immensely as you continue in your work.
That talking to each other is so critical. I think one of the things you pointed out in the book is just highlighting the research that shows that students aren't transferring the information perhaps from one area to another. I teach writing, and yet I hear from my colleagues in the sciences that their students can't write. Well, I know they can write. I've just seen them write the semester previous, but are we doing enough to help them understand that there are different contexts for writing? So writing for the humanities may look different than writing for the sciences, as well as writing outside for employment. And are we having those conversations between departments about those kinds of elements of student learning? But then the broader pieces about critical thinking and other forms of communication and quantitative reasoning. I think because we exist in our silos, and that's just really silos between faculty. But then, the learning systems paradigm really speaks to the entire campus. The student who has work study employment on campus, are we in any way linking, even if it doesn't to them seem related to their major, how can we relate to those soft skills, or what was called yesterday power skills, which I really like. So, facilitating those conversations. And I think that's a second piece of the paradigm that I really appreciated, was about that consensus and the communication that's necessary to develop that alignment. And so in terms of recommending, it's like, have those conversations that we often overlook as necessary. As we talk about kind of higher education's traditional role as a place to sharpen academic and workplace skills, things like critical thinking, communication, plus employment skills. When you touch on the application of equity in the learning systems paradigm, how do we integrate both the central focus, the ongoing focus of education, with the integration of our values, such as equity and racial justice? Are there ways we can design our learning systems to promote both equity and academic learning?
Yes. Yeah, 1,000 times yes. So I think for us, there's four parts of the paradigm that we saw, and each of them are very interconnected and work to address this. And when we did this work, when we were tracking and mapping the DQP, that work has evolved into a huge strand of equity work within the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment that came really out of those four areas that we were focused on originally. So we talked about alignment and consensus. So do we know what we're talking about within our own institution? And do we know how our different pieces, if we say these pieces are moving us towards something, move us towards that? But the last two pieces really are where that equity piece can come into play so elegantly in aligning our values with what we're doing in our day-to-day experience with students. And that was that it needs to be learner-centered, and it needs to be communicated. And when we were talking about communicated, it's really that I'm constantly telling you, not on like the first day, you got a syllabus, you're overwhelmed, all these things. And yeah, you're like, don't you remember? It was on that document. And you're like, I've lost it and I don't even know. And this is so important, even more now, and with our attention spans just incredibly limited, the amount of things going on for our students and our faculty and staff during a pandemic, the being clear in, this is what I'm asking you to do. This is why it matters. And this is how it connects to something else. And when you've done that here, that's the same thing. And helping teach that reflection, that metacognition, and that transference of learning. There was a great study that was done in student employment. It started in Iowa Grow, and it's moved into a variety of different models since then, where they would ask student employees questions about what are you doing in your job that is applicable to your coursework, and what are you doing in your coursework that's applicable to your job? And the first time you'd get asked, you'd get like a teenager response, like, what have you done today? And they're like, I don't know, nothing, right? So the students will be like, I don't know, I don't see a connection, because we've never asked them to look at that. As much as we have barriers in a systems view, our students have barriers put up for survival, which is like, I'm now going to class, then I now go to work. And then when this semester's done or quarter's done, this is over, I'm now doing this learning. And so it's inherently compartmentalized. So we have to be very clear to our students, there is a connection point here. There's a reason and design to all of the things that we ask you to do. It's not like we just did this because we're mean or we want to cause you pain, but there's a purpose behind it. And we have to make that purpose very clear to our students, make those connection points clear. And that can also even help close equity gaps in the work that's been done around assignment design by Mary Ann Winklemas, which I think is great. If anybody wants to look on how do you look at your assignment prompt to be clear for students so they can actually do what it is you're asking them to do. So really very cool stuff. But the learner-centered piece also says, we're very aware that our institutions were built not for students, or not for these students that we have in mind. And how can we ensure that every step of the way, we're not just going, oh, we're keeping students in the center, but we're actively involving students. We aren't assuming we know what's best for them. We're involving them in the process. They have agency in their learning. It's not the lucky few that figure out how to find the resources or navigate a system, but it's pushed into that. And so not only does that mean when you're in that learning experience, you're going to get more from it and have a better relationship with our institution, but we're also addressing those issues of systemic barriers and inequities that have been sort of baked into our institutions. And the only way to do that is to really have some of those hard conversations and engage in it. So long-winded way of saying yes, I think that there's definitely ways to put all of this together towards equity. Assessment does have a history in measurement, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if people want, and how that sort of impacted our equity conversations. But there's a ton of great work unfolding on what does it mean to infuse equity in assessment? What if assessment was a vehicle for equity? And what does equitable assessment really look like and entail on our institutions and our in a variety of ways? And I'm really excited to see that unfolding nationally.
as we think a little bit more into, you've mentioned kind of starting to look forward. How do we, as we locally and systemically implement a learning systems paradigm and address all of this, how do we continually improve our student learning so that we can obviously give students more success in the future? And as we do that, what can we anticipate as the future of learning over the next 5 years, or even, looking further into the future over the next 20?
That's always an interesting question to ask about the future. It's particularly hard at this time. I have no idea what state budgets are going to look like in relation to higher education. Enrollments are going to be an interesting bag for our students moving forward. We've got COVID-19, there's a racial reckoning, leadership changes that are happening across higher education. From where I sit at the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, the ones that I see is, I think, 5 years out and then a little bit beyond are the focus on how do we document our learning for our students in a way that's incredibly portable and digital. And so there's been work happening nationally on comprehensive learner records, which is I know I can do these things, and embedded in that is the evidence of it, which could have come from a course, it could have come from a co-curricular experience, and all of those sorts of pieces. And then it's digital, so I can take it, I can push them to you, I can push them to an employer, and really thinking about how are we creating data standards that allow that to be ingestible, digestible by those data systems. So on the one hand, as we work on our structures and systems, we need an infrastructure for technology and data that supports that, and that is just as flexible, adaptive, and embedded as our students are and how they move through our systems. So I would love to see that comprehensive learner record work really picks up, and that the way in which students have access to their records become different. It would be really, really neat if I'm going to push out 20 years, if I, as a student, could put forward something that I think counts as learning. I think I met this learning outcome with this demonstration. Tell me if I did. And then a college could say, I'll take a look at that in relation to this. Yes, you did, or no, you didn't. And really think differently too about how our students engage with our institutions in that learning as a currency sort of piece. But that's later. I also think because of all the conversations that have been unfolding in the last several years on equity and assessment, that we're really going to see some fascinating work on that, some frameworks, some models, really rethinking those demonstrations of learning to be much more equitable. And while it started as conversations and conference themes and all of this, I think we're definitely moving into the practice piece of that at this juncture. And so that will continue moving in that direction.